Good evening, friend. Come in and let the door close soft behind you. Wherever you have been today, whatever it asked of you, you can leave it on the step outside. Pull the blanket up over your shoulder. Let your hands go loose in your lap or against the sheets. Let your breathing slow until you stop noticing it, which is really the only goal we have tonight. We are going somewhere quiet. A house at the end of a long gravel drive in the English countryside. The kind of house with more rooms than any family could ever properly fill, standing under a sky already going the color of a bruise as the sun drops behind a line of elm trees. It is October of 1926. Somewhere inside that house, a fire is being built up in a grate that has not gone cold since September, and somewhere else inside it, 30 feet below the room where that fire is burning, a girl not yet 25 is folding linen, so precisely that the corners could cut paper. That is the shape of the evening we are stepping into. Upstairs, champagne corks and gramophone records, and pearls being clasped round throats by candlelight. Downstairs, largely unseen by anyone upstairs, a machine made entirely of human beings, moving in near total silence, keeping the whole beautiful evening from ever falling apart. There is a kind of quiet that belongs only to old houses in the evening, and it is different from the quiet of an empty house. It is the quiet of a house that is extremely busy, trying not to be heard. That is the quiet we are walking into tonight. You do not need to hold on to names or dates. This is not a lecture. You only need to let the details arrive, one after another. The smell of beeswax on a banister, the tick of a bellboard somewhere down a corridor, the particular hush of a house where raising your voice after dark, if you happen to be one of the people who work there, simply was not done. So get settled. Turn the light down low if you have not already. And when you are ready, we will walk up that gravel drive together, into the mist, toward a door that is only a few minutes from opening. Tonight, we are going to follow one English country house through a single autumn day in 1926. From the moment the household wakes in the dark, before 6 in the morning, to the moment the last hot water bottle is carried up a back staircase, and the house, finally, completely, sleeps. The version of this world most of us carry around in our heads comes from films and glossy dramas. Draped ball gowns, witty banter over the soup course, a butler who materializes exactly when needed and vanishes just as neatly. It is a lovely version. It is also, in almost every way that matters, wrong. The real version has fewer jokes in it and a great deal more physical labor. It has grown women with permanently swollen knuckles from black leading grates. Before dawn it has a strict, almost military hierarchy that decided who could speak to whom, in what order, and with how much eye contact. It has an entire language of bells and silver trays that let two people occupy the same room and never once need to converse. Tonight you will meet a housemaid named Edith Marlowe, 24 years old, who has worked in this house since she was a girl of 18, and through her eyes we will cross back and forth between two worlds that existed 20 feet apart from one another, and yet, in the ways that mattered, might as well have sat on separate continents. By the time we finish, I think the picture in your head of a house like this one will look rather different than it does right now. Not shattered, just filled in with the kind of detail that rarely makes it into the films. Before we go any further, if evenings like this one are the sort of thing you enjoy, history that feels like a room you can sit inside rather than a page you have to study, I would love it if you considered subscribing. It costs nothing, and it helps this small channel keep finding its way to people who might need a quiet hour before bed. And if you would like to, tell me in the comments where you are tonight, and what the clock says where you are. I read every one of them, usually with my own cup of tea going cold beside me. Wherever you have settled in tonight, I am glad of the company. Now let us go back. It is a little before 6 in the morning at Aldermere Hall, and the only light anywhere in the building is a single candle moving down a narrow staircase in the hand of a girl who has been awake, by habit, by necessity, for exactly 4 minutes. It is the autumn of 1926, in a fold of the Oxfordshire countryside, where the land rolls in low green waves toward a river nobody outside the county has ever heard of. The harvest came in 3 weeks ago. The stubble fields still smell faintly of cut straw and diesel from the threshing machine, and the hedgerows are thick with hips and haws, red against a sky the color of dishwater. This October has been a wet one. Farmers along the valley are calling it the wettest since the war, and every morning the fields wear a mist that does not lift until nearly 9, curling low over the pasture, like something breathing. 2 miles from the house we are visiting sits the village of Shepton Underhill, which is less a village than a single crooked street of honey-coloured stone cottages, a church with a square Norman tower, a smithy that still shoes the farm horses, and, increasingly, repairs the odd motor car, and a general shop that sells everything from paraffin to peppermints. Wood smoke hangs over the chimneys most mornings, and underneath it, if the wind is right, you can smell the cows being brought in for milking and the damp wool of the men walking the lanes to the fields before full light. It is 1926, and this autumn carries an undertone that would not have been there 5 years earlier. The coal miners have been locked out of the pits since May. The strike that shut down the whole country for 9 days that same month, still spoken of in low voices at the smithy, and the newspapers that arrive on the milk cart each morning carry headlines about hardship in the mining valleys 150 miles to the west. None of that touches Shepton Underhill directly, but it sits underneath the ordinary business of the day, the way a held breath sits underneath a conversation, and the people of this valley are aware of it even while they go on with their own smaller concerns, which this week mostly concern the weather and the price of feed. At this hour, just past 5, the village carries its own small chorus of sound, rooks settling noisily into the bare elms behind the churchyard, a dog barking somewhere down a side lane, the far-off muffled whistle of the branch-line train pulling out of the market town 6 miles off, its smoke visible for a moment above the tree line before the mist swallows it again. A carter's cart creaks past the smithy, iron-wheeled and heavy-laden, bound for the mill before dark, and for a moment its wheels are the loudest sound in the whole valley. The numbers of this world are worth pausing over, because they explain everything that is about to happen once we step through the gates of the big house. A farm labourer here earns something close to 30 shillings a week, which is £1.50 in the coin of the realm, and out of that he pays perhaps 5 shillings in rent for a tied cottage that belongs more often than not to the very estate he works for. A loaf of bread costs about 4p. A pound of best butter runs to 2 shillings. A housemaid in service, by contrast, earns very little in cash, something in the range of £22 to £26 a year, but her board, her food, her uniform, and her bed are all provided, which is precisely why so many young women from cottages like the ones lining Shepton Underhill's High Street chose service in the first place. It was not glamorous. It was, however, one of the very few forms of steady employment open to a girl of 14 with no family money and no special skill beyond willing hands and a strong back. Up the valley from the village, past a stand of beech trees just beginning to turn the colour of weak tea, a pair of iron gates opens onto a drive of raked gravel that runs for the better part of half a mile before the house itself comes into view. This is Aldermere Hall, And if you were seeing it for the first time this evening, in the last grey light before full dark, you would see a long facade of pale Cotswold stone, honey-coloured in daylight and nearly silver in this failing light, 3 stories of tall sashed windows, and a roofline broken by chimney stacks, 12 of them, each one drawing smoke from a fire lit somewhere inside. Ivy has been let grow up one wing and trimmed hard back from the other, a small vanity of Sir Henry's mother, the previous Lady Calloway, that the current household has simply never bothered to correct. Behind the house, out of sight from the drive, sits a walled kitchen garden with glass houses for the grapes and the peaches, a stable block that used to house 12 horses now houses 4, along with 2 motor cars, and a laundry building set well apart from the main house, because the smell of a working laundry is not the sort of thing a household wants drifting through the drawing room windows. Step through the front door itself, and the house reveals its age in layers. The entrance hall dates from the original Jacobean building, oak-panelled, nearly black, with 3 centuries of wood smoke and beeswax, hung with the family's portraits, going back 6 generations, stern painted faces in ruffs, and later in powdered wigs, and later still in the high collars of the last century, watching over whoever happens to be crossing the stone-flagged floor beneath them. The drawing room and the library were added later, the 1820s, tall, bright rooms with plaster ceilings and long sash windows that look out over the south lawn. A deliberate contrast to the older, darker rooms they adjoin, built at a time when the family that owned Aldermere Hall wanted, quite plainly, to be seen as fashionable rather than merely ancient. The great staircase, climbing from the entrance hall, carries its own smell, beeswax and old wood, and faintly the coal smoke that seeps into everything in a house heated entirely by open fires, a smell so constant that nobody living inside these walls notices it anymore, though a visitor arriving fresh from London remarks on it almost every single time. Nearly every cottage along the Shepton Underhill High Street belongs, in truth, not to the family living in it, but to the Aldermere estate itself, held on terms that tie a labourer's home directly to his employment on the land, a tenant cottage bound up with a wage in ways that meant losing one, very often meant losing the other soon after. The vicar, a mild bird-like man named the Reverend Aldous Pike, has held the living here for 18 years and dines at Aldermere Hall perhaps 4 times a year, invited more from custom than any real closeness between himself and Sir Henry. Thursday is market day in the town 6 miles further on, when carts loaded with cheese and eggs and the last of the autumn apples rattle down the lane past the estate gates before dawn, and it is one of the few mornings when Shepton Underhill's single crooked street shows any real bustle at all. On every other morning, the village keeps to itself, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the church clock striking the hours over fields that belong, in the end, almost entirely to one family and the small society of tenants, labourers and servants whose own lives were shaped, in ways large and small, by that single fact of ownership. The house belongs to Sir Henry Calloway and his wife, Lady Margaret, who inherited it from Sir Henry's father in the years just before the war and have spent every autumn since filling it, for a long weekend at a stretch, with house guests. This weekend is no different in shape from a dozen others this year, though it matters a great deal to the people living inside these walls, for reasons we will come to. What matters to us, standing at the end of this drive, as the light continues to drop and the first true chill of the evening settles into the gravel under our feet, is simpler. Somewhere inside that long stone facade, 32 people are about to sit down to a dinner that will take 4 hours to prepare and perhaps 90 minutes to eat. And every single one of those 90 minutes will depend on a second, invisible household of servants who have already been awake this day for the better part of 14 hours. Let us go and meet one of them. The house itself divides, the moment you step past its front door, into 2 entirely separate buildings occupying the same set of stone walls. Ahead of the entrance hall lie the rooms a guest would recognize. The drawing room with its Persian carpets and its wood fire built high enough to warm 20 people. The library with its smell of leather and pipe smoke. The long dining room where the family portraits watch over whoever happens to be eating below them. Behind a plain door, covered in green baize, tucked so unobtrusively into the paneling of the entrance hall that a stranger might walk past it 3 times without noticing, lies the other building entirely. Bare stone passages, bells on coiled springs, a world with its own weather, its own clock, and its own rules. And it is through that door, at 6 o'clock this same morning, some 14 hours before the guests we will meet later tonight even climbed into their motorcars. Her name is Edith Marlowe. She is 24 years old, unmarried, born in a tied cottage, not unlike the ones we just passed on the Shepton Underhill High Street, the third of 6 children belonging to a hedger and ditcher who worked this same estate for 30 years before his knees gave out. She came into service at Aldermere Hall at 18 as a scullery maid, which meant 6 months of nothing but blackened pots and raw chapped hands before Mrs. Pans. Yarrow, the housekeeper, decided she showed enough sense to be moved upstairs into housemaid's work proper. 6 years later, she is the senior of the 2 housemaids under Mrs. Yarrow's authority, which is a small promotion in the world outside these walls and a considerable one inside them. It means she no longer empties the worst of the chamber pots. It means the newer girl, a 16-year-old called Peg, who arrived from the village in the spring, follows 2 paces behind her and does what she is told. It does not mean, in any sense that would be recognizable to the guests upstairs, that Edith Marlowe has stopped working with her hands for 14 hours a day. Aldermere Hall keeps, this autumn, a household of 16 indoor servants, a number that Mrs. Yarrow will tell you, if you ask her over a cup of tea in the housekeeper's room, is already thin compared to what the house employed before the war. Sir Henry's father kept 22. The war took the footmen off to fight, and 2 of them did not come back, and the ones who did come back mostly did not return to service at all, having discovered, in the trenches or the factories that followed them, that there were other ways for a man to earn a living that did not involve powdering his hair and standing silent behind another man's chair. This is a thread we will pull on properly later in the evening, because it matters more than it might seem to right now. For the moment, understand only that the household beneath Aldermere's baize door runs leaner than it once did, and that everyone inside it, from the butler down to Peg the under-housemaid, works harder for it. The hierarchy itself is a structure nearly as rigid as anything upstairs and considerably less forgiving. At the top sits Mr. Pruitt, the butler, who has served this family for 11 years and answers, in matters of the house, to nobody but Sir Henry himself. Beneath him, and technically his equal in authority, though never quite treated as such, Yarrow, the housekeeper, who runs the female side of the household, with a set of keys at her waist and a ledger that accounts for every candle, every bar of soap, every yard of linen the house consumes. Below them, both sit the specialists. Mrs. Odell in the kitchen, who has not left the grounds of Aldermere for longer than an afternoon in 9 years, and considers this a point of professional pride rather than deprivation. Miss Ferris, lady's maid to Lady Margaret, who dresses hair and mends lace and knows more of the family's private business than anyone else alive, including, some of the other servants privately suspect, Sir Henry, Mr. Coyne, the valet, whose entire working life is organized around the proper condition of one man's boots, collars, and evening dress. Below the specialists come the footmen, Thomas and Walter, tall young men chosen partly for their height and their matched appearance in livery, and below them the hall boy, Sam, who is 14 and cleans boots and carries coal and is generally treated as everyone's junior. And below all of them, in the strict but largely unspoken accounting of who may eat where and sit in which chair in the servants' hall, come the maids. Edith, Peg, a scullery maid, younger still, a laundry maid who works mostly out of sight in the separate building behind the stable block. Even Edith's appearance belongs, in its own quiet way, to this same rigid grammar of rank. Her uniform changes twice through the course of a working day, a plain print dress and coarse apron for the rough morning work. Then, from early afternoon onward, a black dress, starched white apron, and a small white cap that must sit at precisely the correct angle. No jewellery of any kind permitted beyond a small brooch worn at the collar. Her hair pinned entirely out of sight beneath the cap. 'Tis, in its way, a uniform every bit as codified as Sir Henry's white tie and tails, and every bit as expressive of what it is meant to communicate. In this case, not wealth, but a kind of visible discipline, proof to any guest glancing her way that this household is properly, correctly run. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you understand it properly. The people who kept a house like Aldermere running were not a formless staff of interchangeable help. They were a society unto themselves, with its own aristocracy and its own lower orders, its own etiquette about who spoke first and who waited to be addressed, and its own entirely private opinions, rarely shared with anyone above stairs, about the family they served. Edith's own opinions, if you managed to earn enough of her trust to hear them, would surprise anyone who imagines domestic servants as either grateful or invisible or both. She thinks Sir Henry is fair, but distant, the sort of employer who would not recognize her outside the house if he passed her in the village. She thinks Lady Margaret works harder than she is given credit for, managing a household budget and a full calendar of social obligation with a precision that Edith, watching from the edges of rooms while she dusts, has come to genuinely respect. She has a private, carefully guarded opinion about the young man currently courting Miss Diana, the Calloway's only daughter, a Mr. Julian Aske, who Edith privately considers rather pleased with himself, though she has never once said so aloud and never will, because a housemaid's opinion of a gentleman is not a thing that is asked for, and offering it unasked is one of the surest ways to find yourself out of a position with no character reference to show for it. There is one more thing worth knowing about her before we follow her further into the day, because it will matter later, quietly, at the very end of this evening. Edith keeps company in the modest and carefully chaperoned way available to a young woman in her position with a young man named Walter Higgs, not to be confused with Walter the footman, who works as under gardener on the same estate and lives with his own family in a cottage not unlike the one Edith grew up in herself. They exchange perhaps 20 minutes of actual conversation most weeks, over a garden wall or across the yard where the deliveries come in, and once a month, on her half-day, they walk together as far as the market town and back. Nothing has been formally arranged between them. Both understand, without ever discussing it plainly, that marriage would mean the end of Edith's position at Aldermere Hall, since a married woman was very rarely kept on in service. And both understand, too, that this is a decision still some way off, not yet needing to be made. It sits in the back of Edith's mind most days the way her shorthand manual does. Another quiet, unresolved shape her future might eventually take. What almost nobody upstairs knows about Edith Marlowe, and very few of the servants know either, is that she keeps a small tin box under a loose floorboard in the attic room she shares with Peg, and inside it are a stub of pencil, a school exercise book, all filled with looping practice shorthand, and a library card from the free library in the market town. borrowed on her single half-day off each month. She is teaching herself Pitman's shorthand from a manual she bought for sixpence, because she has heard from a cousin working in an office in Oxford that a girl who can take dictation and type can earn nearly twice what a housemaid earns, and can go home each evening to her own room instead of an attic she shares with someone else's snoring. It is not a plan she has told anyone about. It is, in its quiet way, the only part of her day that belongs entirely to her. The household book itself is worth a moment's attention. A thick, cloth-bound ledger, kept always on the small desk in Mrs. Bragg. Yarrow's own sitting room, ruled by hand into columns for every servant's name and every day of the week. Tasks entered in advance and ticked off in a neat descending column. As each one is completed, it is, in its own quiet way, the true engine of Aldermere Hall, a document that translates the family's entire social calendar into 16 individual sets of daily instructions, and Edith's whole day, before she has even opened her eyes this morning, already exists in full inside its pages. Today, though, there is very little room in Edith's schedule for shorthand practice, because today is what Mrs. Yarrow's household book calls, in her small, precise handwriting pinned to the corkboard in the servants' hall, a full house day. 4 guests have been staying at Aldermere since Thursday. 6 more arrived yesterday. And this evening, as darkness falls properly over the valley, another dozen will arrive by motorcar for dinner, and a small dance in the long gallery, bringing the total number of people to be fed, warmed, dressed, attended to this night to 32. Every fire in every occupied bedroom must be laid and lit before the guests rise. Every drop of hot water for morning washing must be carried up by hand. Every gown that will be worn tonight must be pressed and hung and ready, and every piece of silver that will touch the dinner table must be polished to a shine that will catch and hold candlelight without a single visible fingerprint. It is not yet 6:30 in the morning. Edith has been awake for slightly under half an hour, and she has, by her own private count, something close to 19 hours of work standing between her and her narrow iron bed. She does not think of this as remarkable. It is simply Saturday. It is 6:15, and Edith's candle has already carried her down 2 flights of the back stairs, the ones with no carpet and no decoration, worn into a shallow dip in the middle of each tread by decades of servants' feet. She moves in stockinged feet herself for the first hour of every morning, her boots tucked under one arm, because a housemaid's boots on bare stone, at this hour, can be heard 2 floors up, and being heard is the one thing Mrs. Yarrow has drilled into every girl who has ever worked under her. You are not required to be silent because anyone has asked you to be cruel. You are required to be silent because the entire idea of a house like Aldermere Hall, the fantasy the guests upstairs are paying in their own way, to inhabit depends on believing that warm grates and hot water and perfectly ironed newspapers simply occur. Her first task of the day is the grate, and there are, this morning, 14 of them needing attention before the house properly wakes. Each one must be riddled out, cold ash from the night before raked through a grid at the bottom of the fireplace, and carried away in a covered pail so that no dust escapes into the room, because dust on a guest dressing table by 9 in the morning. Yarrow's accounting very badly indeed. The grate itself is then black-leaded, a paste of graphite and turpentine, worked into the iron with a hard brush until it takes on a dull gunmetal shine, a task that leaves a fine black residue under the fingernails no amount of scrubbing entirely removes, which is why Edith and every housemaid she has ever known keeps her hands. Whenever she is not actively working, tucked out of sight in the folds of her apron. Only once the grate is clean does the actual fire go in, laid in a particular order she could build blind after 6 years of practice. Twists of newspaper first, then kindling, then 2 carefully chosen pieces of coal, arranged so the whole thing will catch with a single match the moment a girl comes back through, an hour later, to light it before the room's occupant rises. 14 grates. Some mornings it is more. The drawing room alone takes real effort, a fire built to warm a room the size of a small church. And Edith has learned over the years to read which rooms will be needed hardest by nightfall and lay those fires with slightly more coal than the others. A small, private economy of judgment that nobody has ever thanked her for and nobody upstairs even knows exists. By 6:15, she is back down in the servants' hall, where the household eats its own first meal of the day, standing mostly at a long scrub table, in an order of precedence nearly as fixed as anything observed above stairs. Pruitt and Mrs. Yarrow sit at the head and take their tea from a different pot than everyone else, a small dignity that cost the household nothing and matters enormously to the 2 people observing it. The footmen sit below them. The maids below the footmen. Sam, the hall boy, still visibly not quite awake, sits at the very foot of the table and is served last. And if you are picturing this as some cozy scene of below-stairs camaraderie, warm gossip over porridge before the day's grind begins, you would not be entirely wrong, but you would be missing something too. There is warmth here, real warmth, the fellowship of people who share both hardship and a joke about the family upstairs that none of them would ever risk saying aloud in front of a guest. But there is also a hierarchy being quietly enforced with every cup of tea poured in a certain order. And the newer girls learn very quickly that friendliness below stairs has limits every bit as real, if less visible, as the ones observed above them. The porridge this morning is thick and plain, sweetened with a spoonful of treacle, if you are lucky enough to reach the jar before Walter empties it. And there is bread and dripping besides, saved from last night's roast. The kind of food that exists to put fuel into a body that is about to be asked for 14 hours of hard physical labor and does not much care whether that fuel is elegant. There is, this same morning, a small running joke moving down the table that has kept the servants' hall entertained for 3 days now, concerning one of the visiting guests, Colonel Whitfield's elderly terrier, which has taken a fierce and entirely one-sided dislike to Mr. Core. Pruitt's polished shoes, and has twice attempted, unsuccessfully, to remove one from his foot while he stood serving at table. Sam retells the story each morning with fresh embellishment, the dog growing a little larger, Pruitt's dignity a little more wounded. With each telling, and even Mrs. Yarrow, who rarely allows herself more than a small tight smile at breakfast, cannot quite keep a straight face through this morning's version. It is a small thing, but it is also, in its own modest way, exactly the sort of warmth that lets 16 people work 14-hour days beside one another without the whole arrangement curdling into something considerably more bitter than it was. By 6:30, Peg the scullery maid has already been at the silver for the better part of an hour, working under a single gas jet in a windowless room off the kitchen passage that everyone below stairs calls, without any irony, the plate room. This morning's task is the fish knives and forks that will be needed for tonight's dinner, 3 dozen of them, each one worked over with a paste of powdered chalk mixed with methylated spirits, rubbed in with a soft cloth, then buffed until the metal gives back a reflection sharp enough to see your own eye in. It is monotonous work. It is hard on the hands, the spirits drying the skin, and the chalk working its way into every crack and callus. And Peg, who is 16 and has been doing this exact job for exactly 7 months, has already learned to keep her hands submerged in a bowl of warm water between pieces to keep the cracking from turning into something worse. Edith passes through twice this morning to check her progress, not out of unkindness, but out of the plain fact that if a single fish knife is spotted at dinner tonight, it will not be Peg who answers for it to Mrs. Yarrow. It will be Edith as her senior. Down the passage, in the small room set aside for exactly this purpose, Thomas and Walter, the two footmen, are ironing the morning newspapers. This sounds, the first time you hear it, like an eccentricity invented for a comedy of manners. And it is, in fact, a real and entirely practical task performed in houses like this one across the whole of England this same morning. Fresh newsprint transfers ink onto anything it touches, and a gentleman does not care to find his fingertips and shirt cuffs smudged grey before he has finished his first cup of coffee. So the papers delivered by bicycle from the station an hour earlier are pressed flat and warm with a heavy flat iron, the ink set just enough that it will survive a careful reading without transferring onto anyone's hands, then folded precisely and laid on a tray beside the coffee service. It takes Thomas and Walter the better part of 20 minutes each morning, a task that will never once be mentioned by any of the guests who benefit from it, because as far as those guests are concerned, the newspaper simply arrives at the breakfast table in a state of perfect, ink-free crispness, the way the fires simply arrive already burning. Beyond the kitchen passage, out past the stable block, the estate's other invisible workers are already well into their own mornings. In the laundry building, set apart from the main house precisely so its smell and steam never reach the family's rooms, the laundry maid, a quiet woman named Ruth, who has held the post for 11 years and rarely sets foot in the main house at all, is already up to her elbows in yesterday's linen, boiling sheets in a copper set over its own small fire, wringing them by hand before they go out to the drying green behind the walled garden. 6 additional guests tonight mean 6 additional sets of sheets and towels to be readied by tomorrow, and Ruth's day, unseen by everyone except the other servants who pass her building on their own errands, runs every bit as long as Edith's own. Further off still, the gamekeeper, a withered man called Frost who has walked these coverts since before Sir Henry was born, has been out since well before first light with his beaters, preparing the birds for the afternoon shoot, while in the converted stable that now houses the family's 2 motor cars. The young chauffeur is wiping down chrome and leather with a chamois in the cold morning air. Work that will never once be mentioned by any guest stepping into a gleaming car later this evening, but without which that same gleaming car would simply not exist. Somewhere around 7, the first bell rings. Aldermere Hall's bellboard hangs in the service corridor outside the kitchen, a long panel of small brass bells on coiled springs, each one wired to a pull cord in a different bedroom, each one labelled in Mrs. Bra. Yarrow's careful hand with the name of the room it serves. The Blue Room, the East Bedroom, the Rose Room. When a guest wakes and wants tea, or hot water, or simply a maid to draw the curtains, they pull the cord beside their bed, and somewhere below, a small brass bell on a coiled spring ticks and trembles and rings, and whichever maid or footman is nearest goes running. It is an entire language, built to let 2 people occupy the same house, sometimes the same floor, and never once need to speak directly to one another. A guest need never learn a servant's name, need never so much as glance at the girl who brings the hot water, because the request has already travelled through brass and wire before a human voice was ever required. This morning the Blue Room rings first, followed within a minute by the East Bedroom, and Edith is already halfway up the back stairs, with a jug of hot water balanced against her hip before the second bell has finished trembling. She knocks, waits for permission, enters with her eyes carefully lowered from the moment the door opens, sets the water down at the washstand without a word beyond the necessary good morning, and withdraws. This happens, in one form or another, perhaps 30 times before 9 o'clock. It is the part of service work that almost never appears in the paintings and the films, the sheer repeated physical labor of it. Water carried up flight after flight because Aldermere Hall, like most houses of its age, has plumbing only as far as the kitchen, which means every gallon of water any guest washes with this morning has been heated on the kitchen range and carried up by hand by a girl who will then carry the used water back down an hour later. Now, here is where most accounts of a house like this one get something quietly wrong. They imagine the relationship between the family and the people who serve them as either warm and familial, the loyal old retainer beloved by all, or else openly cruel, a house of petty tyranny and slammed doors. The truth, for a household like Aldermere's, sits somewhere stranger than either. Lady Margaret is, by every account Edith would give you, a considerate employer. She remembers Mrs. Odell's birthday. She once sat up half a night with Peg when the girl had a fever, sending for the doctor at her own expense. And yet Edith has worked in this house for 6 years and has exchanged, in that entire time, perhaps 24 direct sentences with Lady Margaret that were not instructions. It is simply the structure of the world both women were born into, structure built so thoroughly around not seeing the labor that made a house run that even a kind employer rarely thought to look directly at the person providing it. Edith has made her peace with this the way one makes peace with weather. It is simply how the house is built in every sense of the word. Before that first guest ever sets foot in the breakfast room, there is a stretch of work that belongs entirely to the front of the house rather than the bedrooms above it. The brass fittings along the main staircase, the stair rods holding the carpet in place at every step, the letterbox and the door furniture at the entrance itself. All of it needs polishing fresh each morning with a soft chamois and a paste that leaves the metal glowing warm gold in the early light. A task Edith performs on her knees along 32 individual stairs before most of the household has even rung its first bell. The breakfast room sideboard is laid with silver chafing dishes kept hot over small spirit burners, kidneys and bacon and scrambled eggs, and a cold ham for anyone who prefers it, coffee and tea both standing ready in silver pots polished to the same shine as the fish knives Peg finished the night before. None of this is glamorous work, exactly, but it carries its own quiet satisfaction, the plain pleasure of a job whose standard is absolute and whose completion is, at least for a few minutes each morning, entirely visible and entirely Edith's own. By 8:30, the family and their house guests are beginning to come down for breakfast, and the second half of the morning's performance begins in earnest. Hot dishes on the sideboard, footmen standing silent and ready to refill a coffee cup the instant it runs low. Conversation drifting through about the weather, the shooting plan for later, and whether the Ashworths would be bringing their new motor car tonight. Behind the green baize door, the morning's real labor continues without pause. Bedrooms must be done while their occupants are at breakfast, fires freshly made up, washstands emptied and refilled, beds stripped and remade with linen sheets so heavily starched they crackle underhand. Dust must be chased from every surface with a soft cloth before it has any chance to settle where a guest's eye might land on it. And somewhere in the middle of all this, Edith finds 4 unclaimed minutes to stand at a landing window and watch the mist finally beginning to burn off the valley below. The first truly quiet moment she has had since 6:15. She takes it because a housemaid learns early that 4 minutes of stillness, stolen rather than granted, were worth holding on to exactly as carefully as the good silver. Let us stop here for a moment before we follow Edith any further into her morning. because there is a set of numbers underneath this whole story that deserves an unhurried look, the way a man might turn a watch over in his hand to see how the mechanism actually works rather than simply what time it tells. Running a house like Aldermere Hall for a single year cost Sir Henry something in the neighbourhood of £4,000, a figure that would have bought, at the wages we discussed a little earlier, roughly 150 years of a farm labourer's working life. Wages for the 16 indoor servants account for perhaps a third of that sum. Mr. Pruitt as butler earns close to £90 a year, the highest wage below stairs by a wide margin, along with his own small sitting room and, unusually for a man in his position, a share of the wine merchant's discount that Sir Henry has never bothered to claim back for himself. Mrs. Yarrow earns somewhat less, perhaps £60, a detail that tells its own story about which kinds of expertise a household of this era chose to reward more richly, since running the domestic side of Aldermere Hall, its linens, its stores, its 16 employees, its ledgers, required every bit as much skill as running the wine cellar. Mrs. Odell, as cook, sits close behind her. The footmen, Thomas and Walter, earn something in the range of £35 to £40, considerably more than Edith's 24, and it is worth sitting with that gap for a moment, because the difference has nothing to do with the difficulty of the work. A footman's principal qualification for his post was, in a great many houses of this period, his height and the symmetry of his calves in silk stockings, since footmen were dressed, quite deliberately, as a kind of decorative display of the family's wealth. Edith's work, by contrast, was harder, more constant, and considerably less visible. And she was paid less for it, because she was a woman, and because the entire wage structure of domestic service in this period had been built, brick by brick. The estate does not purchase everything it consumes, and this matters to the arithmetic as well. The walled kitchen garden behind the house, tended by 2 full-time gardeners under a head gardener named Mr. Mister Rutledge, supplies nearly all of the household's vegetables, most of its fruit, and, through the glasshouses, grapes and peaches that would otherwise have to be shipped up from London hothouses at considerable expense. This is not sentiment. It is a deliberate economy, a working farm's worth of produce grown specifically so that a house like Aldermere Hall need never depend entirely on the market for its own table, and the wages of those 2 gardeners, modest as they are, cost the estate a great deal less across a year than buying the same fruit and vegetables from a greengrocer would. Even here, in a walled garden that guests admire mainly for its prettiness on a summer afternoon, the underlying logic is the same one running through every other corner of this house. Beauty and economy were rarely separate concerns in a world like this one. They were, almost without exception, the very same concern wearing 2 different faces. Consider, too, what the house consumes in a single autumn week like this one. The coal bill, alone for 14 fires, run daily from October through March, comes to something close to £11 a month, nearly half of what Edith earns across an entire year. A gown for Lady Margaret, made by a dressmaker in London for an occasion such as tonight's dinner, might cost £25, a single garment worth more than Peg, the scullery maid, will earn in 12 months of labour. The silk stockings Miss Diana will wear tonight cost more than a farm labourer earns in a week. None of this is presented tonight to make villains of the Calloway family, who are, by the measure of their own time and their own class, considered generous employers. It is presented because the economics of a peerage house like this one were not incidental to the story. They were the story. Every polished fish knife, every perfectly pressed newspaper, every silk gown laid out for evening, represented a transfer of labour and money running almost entirely in one direction, from the many people working below the green baize door to the smaller number of people living above it, and the entire apparatus of politeness, the please and thank you. The quiet good mornings existed in part to make that transfer feel to everyone involved like something other than what it plainly was. Even so, it would be a mistake to imagine the arrangement as simple exploitation with nothing offered in return, because that too misses something true about how people at the time actually understood their own lives. For Edith, and for most of the young women who came into service from villages like Shepton-Underhill, domestic work offered something real. Steady food in a decade when steady food was not guaranteed in every cottage. A roof that did not leak. Wages that, modest as they were, arrived reliably every quarter day and could be saved, few shillings at a time, toward exactly the kind of future Edith is quietly building for herself with her shorthand manual and her library card. It was, in the plain economic terms of the period, one of the better bargains available to a working-class girl, with no capital and no family connections, which is precisely why service remained, for all its long hours and its rigid deference, one of the largest single categories of female employment in the whole of England in 1926. The numbers are worth pausing over because they hold both truths at once. The real unfairness of the wage gap between Edith and the footmen who worked beside her, and the real, if limited, opportunity that service represented for a woman in her position. History rarely offers a single clean verdict, and this corner of it certainly does not. There is more to understand here about where this money actually travelled once it left Sir Henry's account, because the household spending did not simply vanish into the pockets of 16 servants and a coal merchant. It moved through Shepton-Underhill in 100 small channels that kept the whole valley functioning. The butcher in the market town supplied the kitchen with meat on a running account settled quarterly. The dressmaker in London employed her own seamstresses, girls not so very different from Edith, on wages of their own. The coal came by rail from Wales, from pits not unlike the ones currently locked in the dispute that has been simmering since May, which means that even a household as insulated from national events as Aldermere Hall was, in its own quiet way, connected to the very same coalfields whose troubles the newspapers, freshly ironed each morning by Thomas and Walter, were reporting on that very week. Consider as well what tonight's dinner alone will cost, set against everything we have just discussed. 32 people will sit down to a meal of 8 courses, drawn from a wine cellar that Sir Henry's father stocked before the war, and that a wine merchant in London still tops up twice a year, at a cost, most years, of something close to £200. A single case of good champagne runs to nearly £6, more than Peg will see in cash, across 2 months of work in the plate room. The ingredients for tonight's dinner, the game from the estate's own shoot, the fish brought up by the early train packed in ice, the hothouse peaches and grapes grown in the walled garden specifically, so the household need not depend on London prices for such things, would together cost more than Mrs. Mess Odell's own yearly wage, and none of it, not one course of it, will be remembered by most of the guests beyond a vague and pleasant impression of having eaten well, which is, in its own way, the entire point. A dinner, like this one, was never really about the food. It was a demonstration, offered to 32 witnesses at once, that a family like the Callaways could produce an evening of apparently effortless abundance out of thin air, and the effort required to produce that impression of effortlessness is precisely the labor this whole valley beneath the baize door exists to supply. There is one more thread worth pulling before we move on, because it touches Edith rather more directly than the wine cellar does. Servants who travel with visiting guests, a lady's maid accompanying her mistress for the weekend, a valet accompanying his master are traditionally given a small cash gift by the household they are visiting, a custom known simply as the veils, and while Edith herself never travels anywhere, and so never receives one, she and every other servant at Aldermere understand the arithmetic of it perfectly well. A visiting lady's maid might leave Aldermere Hall on Monday morning with 10 shillings pressed into her hand by Mr. Tin. Put on Sir Henry's behalf, a sum that, spread across a season of house parties at half a dozen different estates, could add meaningfully to a servant's yearly income. It was one of the few mechanisms by which money moved sideways within this world, servant to servant, household to household, rather than only downward from employer to employee. And it tells you something about how carefully the whole system had been worked out over generations. Let us return now to the morning itself, because while we have been sitting with these figures, the clock in the servants' hall has kept moving, and there is still a great deal of Edith's day ahead of us. It is 11:30, and out on the west lawn, Sir Henry and 4 of his male guests are climbing into a pair of waiting motorcars with their guns cased and their dogs already whining with excitement in the back, bound for an afternoon shoot on the far side of the estate where the beaters have been walking the coverts since dawn. Lady Margaret and the female guests, meanwhile, are settling into the morning room with correspondence and needlework, and the unhurried conversation of women who have nowhere in especial to be until luncheon. It is, from where they sit, a picture of complete and effortless leisure, and it is precisely that picture, the sense of an entire day stretching ahead, with nothing demanded of it, that cost the household behind the baize door its hardest hours of the whole day to produce. Because here is a detail that surprises most people the first time they hear it. The hour when the family and guests are out of the house, whether at a shoot or a luncheon party or simply scattered across the grounds, is not a quiet hour for the servants at all. It is, in fact, the busiest hour of the day, because it is the only window in which a room can be properly turned out without disturbing its occupant. The moment the last motor car clears the gravel sweep, Edith and Peg move through the guest wing like a small, coordinated storm. Beds are stripped entirely and remade from scratch, rather than simply tidied. Fireplaces get their second attention of the day. Ash cleared, coal replenished, the whole grate reset for evening. Wardrobes are checked, and any clothing needing pressing is carried down to Mr. Prayas, Coin or Miss Ferris, depending on whether it belongs to a gentleman or a lady. Windows are opened for exactly 11 minutes, timed by the little clock on the landing, to air each room before being shut again against the damp. It is, this hour, something close to a race against the clock of somebody else's leisure, and Edith has learned to move through it with an economy of motion that would look, to an outside eye, almost like a kind of physical grace, though nobody has ever once described it to her in those terms. Down in the kitchen, Mrs. Odell is deep into the first serious work of the day's main event. Tonight's dinner will run to 8 courses for 32 people, and the preparation of it began, in truth, 3 days ago, with the ordering of the fish and the game. But this midday marks the point where the actual cooking begins in earnest. A haunch of venison from the estate's own deer park is being larded on the great scrub table at the center of the kitchen. Stock has been simmering since before dawn in a pot large enough for Sam the hallboy to have once memorably, and to his own lasting embarrassment, fallen asleep, leaning against it. The kitchen, at this hour, is a furnace of heat and noise entirely unlike the hushed corridors upstairs, copper pans being scoured, a kitchen maid up to her elbows in pastry. Odell, moving between 3 separate ongoing preparations with the calm, unhurried authority of a woman who has run this exact production perhaps 400 times in her career, and has never once, by her own account, allowed a dinner to go out late. Upstairs, the same hour, luncheon is a considerably lighter affair than dinner will be tonight. Cold tongue and chicken, a dressed salad brought up from the kitchen garden, a fruit tart Mrs. Blaine. Odell finished before dawn to leave herself free for the venison. It is served without ceremony compared to the evening ahead, Walter alone managing the sideboard, while Thomas assists elsewhere, and the conversation around the table stays light and unhurried. Talk of the morning shoot, a horse someone is thinking of buying, whether the fog will clear before the additional guests arrive this evening. Lady Margaret eats quickly herself, her mind already moving ahead to the afternoon's flowers and the evening seating arrangements, and the meal is cleared within 40 minutes, almost exactly the same span of time, though nobody upstairs would ever think to notice that symmetry between the two households sharing one house. It is worth pausing here on the matter of time itself, because this is one of the details a modern audience finds hardest to credit. A housemaid at Aldermere Hall was entitled, by the standards of most houses of this size and period, to a single half-day off each month, along with perhaps a full day at Christmas and another at the annual harvest supper. That was the whole of it. No weekly rest day, such as even a factory worker of the same era could generally expect. No fixed evening hours, no clear boundary at all between working time and her own time beyond the few hours after the household finally slept. Edith's single half-day, when it comes round each month, is the only stretch of her life that belongs entirely to her. The walk into the market town, the library card, the sixpenny shorthand manual, all of it compressed into an afternoon that arrives roughly 12 times a year. It is against that reality, rather than against any modern comparison, that her quiet ambition to leave service altogether makes its fullest sense. At 12:30, the household below stairs sits down to its own midday dinner, the main meal of the servants' day, and it is worth noticing what a strange mirror this makes of the family's own schedule upstairs. The servants eat their heaviest meal at midday because their evening, once the family's dinner is properly underway, will allow for nothing more than something eaten standing up between tasks, a plate of cold meat snatched in 4 minutes in the housekeeper's room. Today, it is a joint of mutton, with vegetables from the kitchen garden, plain food served plainly, eaten quickly, because Mrs. Decius. Yarrow's household book allows exactly 40 minutes for the meal before the afternoon's work resumes, and not 1 minute of that 40 is Edith's own to extend. The bell board, this early afternoon, rings with a different rhythm than it did at dawn. The guests remaining in the house, the ones who chose needlework over a muddy walk behind the guns, ring now and then for tea, for a fresh pen, for a maid to fetch a shawl from an upstairs room because the drawing-room fire, despite 14 hours of a housemaid's labor, has apparently not quite banished the October chill from a woman sitting near the window. Edith answers these calls the same way she answered the ones at dawn, promptly, silently, her eyes lowered, though by early afternoon there is a familiar kind of fatigue setting into her shoulders and the backs of her knees that no amount of training entirely erases the accumulated weight of roughly 9 hours already spent on her feet. Consider, before we reach that moment, what a single tray of afternoon tea actually requires, since it stands as one of the clearest examples of how thoroughly leisure and labor were braided together in a house like this one. The ladies remaining indoors this afternoon will expect tea, 4 exactly, brought to the morning room on a silver service, polished only that morning, with cucumber sandwiches cut so thin they curl at the edges, a seed cake and a Victoria sponge, both made fresh by Mrs. Bling. Odell's kitchen made before dawn, and a pot of the good Darjeeling kept specifically for occasions when guests are present, rather than the household's own plainer blend. Setting out this one tray, cutting the bread thin enough, arranging the stand just so, takes the better part of 40 minutes of careful, invisible preparation for perhaps 20 minutes of unhurried conversation upstairs. And not one of the women enjoying it will ever see the kitchen table where the sandwiches were assembled or the hands that trimmed each crust away. There is a small human moment here worth sitting with. At 2:30, carrying a fresh pot of tea up to the morning room, Edith passes Miss Diana in the corridor, alone for once, standing at a window with an expression Edith recognizes immediately because she has worn something close to it herself. The particular look of a young woman turning an unwelcome decision over in her mind. Miss Diana does not speak to her, and Edith does not expect her to. But for perhaps 3 seconds, the two young women, 20 and 24, separated by every possible circumstance of birth and money, and yet strikingly close in age, occupy the same narrow stretch of corridor in a silence that is not entirely the silence of servant and mistress. Then Miss Diana turns back to the window. Edith continues on with the tea tray, and neither of them will ever mention the moment to anyone, because there is, in truth, no accepted language in this house for a moment like that one to be spoken about at all. By 3 o'clock, extra china and glass are being brought up from the strong room in the cellar, sets used only for occasions of this size, gilt-edged plates that have not seen daylight since the summer garden party, crystal glasses wrapped in tissue and cotton wool that must each be individually unwrapped, checked for chips, and washed again, despite having been perfectly clean when they were put away, because Mrs. Yarrow does not trust 6 months of storage to have left anything spotless. Thomas and Walter carry up crate after crate. Edith and Peg wash and dry and polish glass after glass until the long trestle table set up temporarily in the butler's pantry gleams under the afternoon light coming through a high narrow window. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you sit with it properly. We tend to imagine a grand dinner as something that simply appears on the table, conjured whole out of a wealthy household's general competence. What actually stood behind it was days of accumulated, largely invisible labor, arranged with the precision of a military campaign, executed by people whose names would never once appear in anyone's account of the evening, including, in most cases, their employers' own private diaries. By 4:30, the light outside has already begun to fail, the way it does in an English October, the grey afternoon sliding without any clear transition into a bruised, early dusk. In the kitchen, the pace has quickened again, sauces being finished, the venison resting under a cloth, the first of the soup already warming on the back of the range. Upstairs, the shooting party's motorcars have not yet returned, but Lady Margaret has begun, with the practiced calm of a woman who has done this exact thing, perhaps 200 times before. Her own preparations for the evening ahead, ringing for Miss Ferris to begin laying out the first of what will be several changes of dress required before the evening properly starts. At 4 o'clock, Lady Margaret comes down to the flower room herself, a small task she has never once relinquished to anyone else in all her years at Aldermere, and Edith is sent to assist her, carrying in armfuls of late dahlias and the last of the season's roses cut that morning from the walled garden. It is one of the very few tasks in the whole day where mistress and housemaid work side by side rather than in the choreographed distance the rest of the house requires. Lady Margaret cutting stems and arranging colour with real attention, while Edith fetches water and clears away the trimmed leaves. And for 20 unhurried minutes, something almost like ordinary companionship settles over the small room. 2 women arranging flowers for a table. Neither of them will sit at in quite the same way, come evening. It never becomes conversation exactly, but it is, Edith has come to think, one of the few honest hours in the whole week. The shooting party returns a little after 4:30, motorcars crunching up the gravel, with the dogs already barking before the engines have fully stopped, and the day's bag, Some 40 brace of pheasant along with a scattering of partridge is handed over to the gamekeeper's boy and carried round to the game larder behind the kitchen, where it will hang for several days before any of it reaches a plate. Sir Henry and his guests come in loud, with cold air and mild triumph, boots caked with mud, and it falls to Sam the hall boy to deal with those boots, 40 pairs of them by the time everyone has changed, cleaned and set to dry before morning, task that will occupy him well past the point when every other member of the household has finally gone to bed. It is worth pausing on what the day has cost the bodies doing this work, because the toll rarely appears in anyone's account of an evening like this one. By 4 in the afternoon, Edith's feet have carried her, by her own rough count over the years, something close to 8 or 9 miles across stone floors and narrow staircases, and the ache that settles into the arch of a housemaid's foot by this hour is not a passing discomfort, but a condition that most women in service carried for the whole of their working lives. Mrs. Yarrow's own hands, 20 years further into the same trade, no longer close all the way around a teacup handle on a cold morning. This is simply the physical arithmetic of the work, rarely discussed, never compensated beyond the wage itself, and entirely invisible to anyone standing on the other side of the green baize door. And somewhere in the valley below Aldermere Hall, on the road running up from the market town, the first motor car of the evening's additional guests has already left its garage, its headlamps not yet lit, carrying a family that will arrive in a little under an hour at a house that from the outside will look entirely effortlessly, serenely ready to receive them. Now, the rules governing a world like this one deserve their own unhurried explanation, because nothing that happens tonight, upstairs or down, occurs outside a code so complete that most of the people living inside it would have struggled to explain where it came from or when they first learned it. It simply was. The way weather simply was, and everyone from Sir Henry down to Sam the hall boy had absorbed its logic before they were old enough to question it. Consider first the matter of names, which tells you almost everything about how this world understood a person's worth. Mrs. Yarrow is not married and never has been. She is called Mrs. Brink. Yarrow all the same. An honorary courtesy title granted automatically to any housekeeper of sufficient seniority, a small badge of authority that distinguishes her from the maids beneath her, who are called by their first names alone and often not even the name their own mothers gave them. It was common enough practice in houses of this size for an employer to simply rename a maid to whatever her predecessor had been called, on the theory that it saved the family the trouble of learning a new name each time a girl left service. Edith, at least, kept her own name at Aldermere, a small mercy Lady Margaret extends without ever having been asked to. Though Edith has heard from a cousin in service 2 counties over of housemaids called Mary, for 6 years running, regardless of what name stood on their own birth certificate. Consider, too, the rules of a dinner table, because tonight's seating at Aldermere Hall will be arranged according to a precedence so exact that Mr. Singh Pruitt has spent an hour this very afternoon consulting a small reference book on the order of rank among the guests, deciding who enters the dining room first, who sits nearest Sir Henry, who must, regardless of personal preference, be seated beside whom. A knight's wife outranks an untitled woman, regardless of the untitled woman's own family wealth. An elder son of a peer takes precedence over a younger son of an earl in certain circumstances and not in others. This is not incidental etiquette. It is a complete social mathematics, memorized and applied without visible effort by people trained since childhood to read rank the way a sailor reads weather, and getting it wrong, seating the wrong woman beside the wrong man, was the sort of error that could genuinely embarrass a hostess for a season. There is a smaller, stranger rule worth mentioning here as well, because it will matter directly to what we watch unfold this evening. Fashion in this period observed a strict distinction between what could be worn before 8 o'clock and what could be worn after it. Before 8, a woman of Lady Margaret's standing would wear modest daytime jewellery, simple brooch, perhaps small pearl earrings. After 8, once the household has properly moved into the evening, the rules loosen considerably, permitting the full formal jewels, the diamonds, the long ropes of pearls that would have been considered ostentatious, even faintly vulgar, if worn a single hour earlier. It is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you understand it, because it reveals how thoroughly this world had encoded even the display of wealth into rules of timing and occasion, so that abundance itself had to be meted out according to the clock, never simply worn all at once. Health, in this world, followed its own separate and considerably harsher logic. A servant who fell seriously ill-faced, in the plainest terms, the loss of both her income and her home in the same stroke, since board and lodging came bundled with the position itself. Some employers, Lady Margaret among them, were known to send for a doctor at their own expense when a servant fell ill under their roof, a genuine kindness that nonetheless depended entirely on the individual character of the employer rather than any right the servant could claim. Chilblains were near universal among housemaids, the result of cold hands plunged repeatedly into cold water through an English winter. Rheumatism set in early decades before, a mite in a woman doing less physically punishing work, the cumulative damage of scrubbing stone floors on bare knees and carrying heavy water cans up narrow stairs for years on end. Tuberculosis moved easily through servants' quarters, cramped and often poorly ventilated, even in a house as grand as this one. And the parish doctor in Shepton Underhill, Dr. Fenwick, who has served the district for over 20 years, would tell you plainly, if you asked him, that his patients from the great houses divided cleanly into two populations with two entirely different sets of ailments, the family upstairs suffering from gout and the general complaints of rich food and idle hours, the servants below suffering from the accumulated damage of hard physical labor performed young. There is one more mechanism of control worth naming plainly here, because it shaped the whole of Edith's working life more thoroughly than almost anything else we have discussed. No servant could move from one position to another without what the whole trade called a character, a written reference from her current employer describing her honesty, her competence, and her general conduct. Without one, a girl was in practical terms unemployable in any respectable household, which meant that every single servant in this house lived under the quiet, constant knowledge that her entire future depended on maintaining her employer's good opinion, not merely for the length of her current position. Mrs. Yarrow keeps her own private notebook of small observations on every girl under her, not out of unkindness, but because Sir Henry and Lady Margaret will ask her opinion the day any servant finally gives notice, and that opinion, more than any single skill a housemaid might possess, decides where she goes next. Religion, meanwhile, drew its own quiet lines through this household's day. The family attends church on Sunday mornings and occupies the Calloway family pew, a raised box near the front of Shepton Underhill's parish church that has belonged to this family for over 2 centuries. The servants attend as well, when their duties allow it, though they sit toward the back of the nave, and the household does keep a brief tradition of evening prayers, read aloud by Mr. Black. Pruitt in the servants' hall on Sunday nights, a small ritual that Edith finds, privately, rather more comforting than dutiful, one of the few moments in the week when the entire indoor staff sits together in the same room with no task pressing on any of them. And then there is the matter of education, which shaped, more than almost anything else discussed tonight, the entire trajectory of a life like Edith's. Compulsory schooling in England at this period ran only to the age of 14. And for a girl from a labouring family, even that modest education was frequently interrupted by the practical demands of a household that needed extra hands. Edith herself left the village school at 13 to help her mother after the birth of her youngest brother, and what reading and arithmetic she carries with her today came from 3 years of a rather good village schoolmistress rather than any extended education. It is precisely this gap, the narrow ceiling that a limited early education placed over an entire class of working people, that makes Edith's private evening project with her shorthand manual so quietly significant. She is not simply learning a skill. She is attempting, alone and without any encouragement, beyond her own stubbornness, to build herself a doorway out of a ceiling that most people of her background were never given the tools to even see, let alone climb through. Let us step back now into the evening itself, because outside Aldermere Hall's front door, in the last grey light of an October dusk, the first motorcar of tonight's additional guest has just turned in through the iron gates. It is 5 o'clock, and the mist that never fully lifted from the valley all afternoon has thickened into something closer to fog, damp and grey, settling over the gravel sweep in front of Aldermere Hall in a way that muffles even the sound of an engine until a motorcar is nearly at the door. The first of the evening's additional guests, the Ashworth family from the neighbouring estate, arrive exactly on time, their headlamps swinging 2 pale cones of light across the drive before the car itself becomes visible. Behind them, at intervals of perhaps 10 minutes, 3 more motorcars follow, each one crunching to a stop on the gravel. Each one releasing into the cold, damp air a small cloud of passengers wrapped in fur collars and heavy wool coats that smell, as they step down, of cigars and cold leather and the tang of an engine that has been running for 40 minutes through open countryside. The unloading itself, once each motorcar has fully stopped, takes on its own rolling rhythm, a hat box and a dressing case and a rug for the knees, and a folded travelling coat and a tennis racket somebody has brought entirely out of habit and will never once use this weekend. Each item passed hand to hand from motorcar to porch in a steady, almost musical procession that does not pause until the very last case has cleared the door. Somewhere behind all of it, faint across the wet fields, the church clock in Shepton Underhill strikes 5, the sound arriving soft and delayed through the fog, and a dog barks twice from somewhere near the stable block and then falls silent again. Thomas and Walter are waiting at the door in their evening livery, and what follows happens with a choreography so practiced it looks to anyone watching almost like a single continuous motion, rather than a series of small individual tasks performed by 2 young men who have done this exact sequence. A door opened before a hand reaches the handle, a coat lifted from a pair of shoulders the instant it is loosened, gloves received into a waiting palm without a word exchanged, hat boxes and dressing cases and a folding leather trunk case for the Ashworth's younger daughter carried up the front stairs by Sam and a borrowed groom from the stable. 4 trips, 5, 6, the gravel crunching under each set of boots, the luggage arriving in a rhythm that never quite stops until the last case has cleared the threshold. Inside, the grand hall receives each new arrival in near total silence. Warm firelight against cold, damp coats. The smell of wood smoke meeting the smell of the outside world for just a moment before the outside world is folded away, quite literally, into a cupboard. Guests are shown to their rooms according to a precedence worked out well before their motor cars ever left home. The senior married couples given the best bedrooms in the main wing overlooking the garden. Younger unmarried guests tucked into the smaller rooms above the old nursery. A small, silent geography of rank that nobody among the guests would ever think to question, because it has simply always been done this way. And as each party climbs the stairs behind whichever maid has been assigned to show them up, the first sound of the evening drifts out from the drawing room below, a few uncertain chords on the piano. The notes carrying down the darkened corridors and out into the damp hall where the last of the luggage is still being unloaded. Behind the green baize door, this same hour looks entirely different. The transition from the plush Persian carpet at the entrance hall to the bare, scrubbed pine floorboards of the service corridor happens in the space of a single step. And it is a transition Edith has crossed so many thousands of times that she no longer notices the shift underfoot. Though a stranger crossing it for the first time would likely feel it as something close to changing countries. Here, there is no fire built high enough to warm 20 people. There is a single gas lamp, a stone floor that holds the October chill regardless of season, and a great deal of very fast, very quiet motion, because 6 additional guests means 6 additional rooms that must, in the space of perhaps 40 minutes, be entirely readied, fires lit properly for the first time this evening, rather than merely banked. Water carried up, towels laid, curtains drawn against the fog outside. By 6:30, the dressing ritual proper has begun throughout the house, and it is worth slowing down here, because this hour, more than almost any other in the whole day, reveals just how much labor stood behind an image of effortless elegance. In the blue room, Miss Ferris is helping Lady Margaret into a gown of deep grey silk, the fabric slipping over an underlying structure of careful pinning and precisely placed hooks that takes the better part of 20 minutes to fasten correctly, and working pins into an arrangement that must survive 4 hours of dinner and dancing without a single strand escaping. A small glass atomizer releases 2 careful presses of scent, lavender and bergamot, onto the inside of each wrist, and Lady Margaret sits nearly motionless throughout the entire process, less because she enjoys the stillness than because stillness is, this stage, simply required of her. Beneath the grey silk itself lies a foundation few people outside this room will ever see or think about. A boned undergarment laced snug enough to shape the waist into the correct fashionable line, silk stockings rolled carefully up and secured above the knee, an entire hidden architecture of hooks and laces and pins that Miss Ferris can fasten from memory in the dark if she needed to. Though tonight, at least, she has the benefit of 2 lit candles and an unhurried half-hour. Every motion is slow and deliberate, the hands working with the patience of a craft practiced daily for years, because a hairpin set wrong or a hook fastened crooked will announce itself within the first hour of the evening in a way that cannot be quietly corrected once the guests have gathered. Down the corridor, Mr. Coyne is laying out Sir Henry's evening dress with the same unhurried precision. A starched white shirt front so stiff it could very nearly stand upright on its own. A wing collar that must sit at precisely the correct height. Studs worked through buttonholes too small and too stiff for most men to manage without assistance. Patent leather shoes, buffed to a shine that catches the lamplight the moment Sir Henry steps into them. It is slow, deliberate work, and there is something worth noticing in just how physically restrictive this whole system of formal wear actually was, for men and women both. Corsetry and stiff collars and shoes, never designed for comfort. An entire evening's mobility deliberately traded away in exchange for the correct appearance. In a way that a modern audience, accustomed to clothing built around comfort rather than display, might find genuinely difficult to imagine enduring for even a single evening, let alone as the ordinary shape of one's entire adult life. In the smaller rooms above the old nursery, the younger unmarried guests dress with rather less assistance and rather more haste, Miss Diana changing into pearls that would have been considered too much before 8 o'clock and are, now that the mantel clock on her dressing table reads 7:15, entirely correct. Outside her window, the last daylight has gone completely, the leaded glass panes showing nothing now but the reflected glow of her own bedroom candles, and somewhere below, faint but steady, the soft ticking of half a dozen mantel clocks across half a dozen dressing rooms marks the same shared countdown. When the dinner gong will sound, and none of this private, unhurried preparation will matter anymore, only its finished result. The gong sounds at precisely 8, struck by Mr. Pruitt himself in the entrance hall, and its low, resonant note rolls through the entire house, up the main stairs, along every corridor, reaching guests already dressed and guests still fastening a final cufflink alike, and 32 people begin, from a dozen different rooms, their slow convergence toward the dining room. What follows is, by any reasonable account, a performance, though nobody involved would ever describe it in those terms. Thomas and Walter stand at precise intervals along the table, moving in and out with each course, with a timing so exact it borders on musical. A plate never removed a beat too early. A glass never left empty long enough to be noticed. The soup arrives first, then fish, then the venison, Mrs. Odell has been preparing since midday, each course announced by nothing more than its own quiet arrival. No explanation offered because none is expected. The entire elaborate machinery of the kitchen below reduced, up here, to a single unremarked plate, set gently in front of each guest at exactly the right moment. Conversation rises and falls around the table. Politics touched on lightly and abandoned. Someone mentioning the miners' dispute still dragging on in the coalfields with a kind of detached sympathy that costs nothing and changes nothing before the talk turns, as it always eventually turns at a table like this one, back to hunting and horses and the coming winter's social calendar. The full sequence runs to 8 courses in all. Clear soup, followed by a cream soup for those who prefer it. Then the fish course, a poached sole in a light sauce. Then a small savory entree of sweetbreads before the venison arrives as the meal's true centerpiece. Pruitt himself with a precision that took him years to perfect. After the venison comes a lighter game course, partridge from this same afternoon's shoot, then a chilled almond cream tonight, followed by a savory of anchovies on toast, meant to clear the palate before the meal closes with fruit and nuts set out in silver dishes. 6 different wines accompany the courses in sequence: a sherry with the soup, a hock with the fish, claret with the venison, port brought out only once the ladies have withdrawn to the drawing room, and the gentlemen remain at table a while longer over cigars, a custom neither Sir Henry nor his guests would think to question, and one that leaves Thomas and Walter standing quietly at the sideboard for a further 20 minutes after the meal itself has technically ended. Behind the baize door, dinner service for 32 does not mean rest for anyone. While the dining room proceeds through its 4 hours of ritualized ease, Edith and Peg are moving through the now empty guest wing, turning down each bed, building each fire, back up for the night, filling the first of what will eventually be a dozen hot water bottles wrapped carefully in flannel. The kitchen, meanwhile, is at its own peak intensity, each course timed precisely to leave the dining room the moment its predecessor is cleared. An operation Mrs. Mess. Odell conducts with barely a raised voice, though the heat in that kitchen by 9 o'clock is fierce enough that every kitchen maid working it has long since abandoned any pretense of a dry apron. Not everyone dances. In the library, Sir Henry has settled several of the older gentlemen around the fire, with brandy and cigars, the conversation drifting from the afternoon shoot to the price of land to a motor car. Colonel Whitfield is thinking of buying. The talk unhurried and comfortable in the way of men who have known each other in various combinations for 20 years or more. Lady Margaret moves between the 2 rooms all evening, the dancers and the fireside talkers both, checking without ever appearing to check that every glass stays filled, and every conversation stays pleasant. The quiet management of an evening's mood being, in its own way, every bit as skilled a performance as anything Thomas or Walter manage at the dinner table. Among the dancers tonight is Mr. Dendra. Julian asks. The young man Edith privately considers rather pleased with himself, and it is watching him now, laughing easily with Colonel Whitfield's daughter between dances while Miss Diana stands a short distance away with a smile, that we understand a little better what stood behind her expression at the window. This same afternoon, nobody has announced anything yet, but an understanding of this kind moves through a house like Aldermere Hall long before it is ever spoken aloud, in glances held a beat too long, and conversations that stop the moment a maid enters a room. Most of the servants passing through the long gallery with fresh glasses have already formed their own private opinion about where this thread of the evening is heading. Whether Miss Diana shares that opinion, or wants it, is not a question anyone below stairs would ever presume to ask her directly. It is simply one more thing, observed quietly, filed away, and never mentioned again, the way so much of what passes between the two halves of this house always is. By 10:30, dinner has given way to the drawing room, and, in the long gallery, to dancing. The gramophone has been wound and set going, its horn throwing a thin, bright music out across a floor cleared of its usual furniture, and couples move through a foxtrot, while Miss Diana's earlier piano practice finally finds its proper use, taking a turn at the keys herself when the gramophone needs winding again. Laughter carries down the main stairs and, faintly, through the green baize door itself, where it lands on an audience of servants, eating their own delayed supper, standing up in the housekeeper's room. Cold meat and bread taken in the 4 or 5 minutes anyone can spare between one task and the next. Nobody below stairs begrudges the sound of it exactly. It has simply always been there, the sound of someone else's evening continuing on above their heads, while their own evening is measured out in far smaller and far more exhausted increments. It is close to midnight when the first guests begin drifting toward bed, and the second half of the household's long night quietly begins. Before we follow that second half of the night any further, there is something worth understanding about the wider moment in which this particular evening is taking place, because 1926 was not, in the life of a house like Aldermere Hall, an ordinary year sitting quietly among other ordinary years. It was in ways that would only become fully visible in hindsight, one of the last full seasons of a world that was already coming apart at the seams. However carefully those seams had been pressed and starched for tonight's dinner. Consider what had already changed in the 8 years since the war ended. Before 1914, a house the size of Aldermere Hall would routinely have employed 20 or more indoor servants, and finding them would have posed no real difficulty, since domestic service remained for generations. Close to 1.5 million of them in service nationally at the century's turn. The war changed that arithmetic permanently. Young men went to fight and did not return to livery afterward, having seen, in the trenches or in the munitions factories that employed women in their absence, an entirely different relationship between labor and wage than the one service had ever offered. Young women who spent the war years driving ambulances, working in munitions plants, or keeping the buses running discovered, many of them, that they preferred a factory wage and a room of their own after hours to a housemaid's wage and an attic shared with someone else's snoring. By the time of tonight's dinner, the number of women in domestic service nationally had fallen by several 100,000 from its pre-war peak, and the households that remained, Aldermere included, were running leaner, with fewer hands, doing more with less, exactly as we saw in Edith's own morning. Then there is the matter of the coalfields, which we touched on earlier. and which deserves a fuller accounting here. The general strike that shut down the country for 9 days back in May of this same year, 1926, grew directly out of a dispute over miners' wages and hours, a dispute that the general strike itself failed to resolve, leaving the miners alone on the picket line long after every other union had gone back to work. As Edith moves through Aldermere Hall tonight, laying fires with coal that arrived by rail from those very same contested pits, the miners' lockout is still grinding on into its 6th month. Mining families, 150 miles to the west, enduring a winter of soup kitchens and empty coal scuttles of their own. A hardship that the guests dancing in a long gallery tonight discussed over the soup course and will not think of again before breakfast. It is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you sit with it. The coal warming this house tonight and the coal not being mined at all in South Wales are in the plainest possible sense part of the very same national story. And the distance between the two, a wine glass raised in a warm drawing room, was never as far as either household would have found comfortable to consider. The dispute would not last a great deal longer past this evening. Within another 2 months, hunger and exhausted savings would force the miners back underground on terms considerably worse than the ones they had walked out over. A defeat that would shake the coalfields and the wider trade union movement built around them for a full generation afterward. None of that outcome is yet known on this October night. It sits ahead of everyone in this house, guest and servant alike, an unwritten chapter that the newspapers Thomas and Walter iron each morning. There is a quieter change moving through this world as well, one that touches Edith directly, rather than merely the household around her. In 1918, partway through the war's aftermath, women over the age of 30, who met a small property qualification, gained the right to vote in parliamentary elections for the first time in the nation's history. Edith herself, at 24 and owning no property of her own, does not yet qualify. But the political conversation in the newspapers Thomas and Walter iron each morning has been circling for several years now around extending that same right to every woman over 21, regardless of property. A change that will arrive within 2 more years of this October evening. Edith will be 26 when it happens, old enough by then to cast a vote in a country that, when she was born, had never once considered the idea seriously worth debating. She does not spend much time thinking about this while she works. But it is there, in the background of her decade, the same way her shorthand manual is there, under the loose floorboard, a small, patient piece of evidence that the shape of a woman's possible life was shifting, slowly and unevenly, even while the dinner service tonight proceeds exactly. Technology, too, was beginning its own slow invasion of houses like this one, though Aldermere Hall sits somewhat behind the leading edge of it. The drawing room and the main bedrooms were fitted for electric light 6 years ago, a considerable expense that Sir Henry justified to himself, at the time, as a modernization his neighbors had already made. The service corridors and the attic bedrooms where Edith and Peg sleep remain lit by gas and will remain so for some years yet, because the expense of extending electricity to rooms no guest will ever see was in the accounting of a house like this one simply not considered worth making. Vacuum cleaners exist by 1926, driven by small electric motors, and a handful of grander London houses have already begun replacing the housemaid's broom and dustpan with one, though Aldermere has not, and Mrs. Brett Yarrow, when the subject came up at a housekeepers' meeting in the market town, expressed the private opinion that a machine could never properly reach a corner the way a girl on her knees with a brush could, a judgment that history would, within another generation, prove almost entirely wrong. A wireless set, meanwhile, sits in the corner of the library, a recent addition purchased mainly for Sir Henry's benefit. connected by a tangle of wire to an aerial strung between two chimney stacks, and it has already begun to change, in small ways nobody quite expected, how this household and thousands like it spend an evening. The British Broadcasting Company, only 4 years old this autumn, now carries concerts and news bulletins directly into rooms that would once have relied entirely on their own piano and their own gramophone for music. And the picture house that opened in the market town 3 years ago draws a queue every Saturday night. But on her rare free evenings, Peg herself, sixpence for a seat and an hour spent watching people and places she will very likely never see in person. Entertainment itself, in other words, was quietly ceasing to be something a household manufactured entirely for itself and becoming something manufactured elsewhere and simply received, a shift whose full consequences nobody sitting in Aldermere Hall's library this evening. What would the children of a household like this one, born this same decade, actually grow up to do? Not, in most cases, what their parents did. Peg's own younger sister, 12 years old this autumn, is far more likely to end up behind a shop counter in the market town, or eventually at a telephone exchange, or if the family's luck holds, at a typing pool in Oxford, not unlike the one Edith's cousin already works in. The whole shape of the working world available to a young woman of modest means was quietly reorganizing itself around new categories of labor that had barely existed a generation earlier. Shop work, clerical work, the growing cinema industry that had opened its first picture house in the market town. And every one of these new categories offered something domestic service, almost never had a clearly bounded working day and evenings that belonged, at least in principle, to the worker rather than the employer. Even the great house itself, for all its apparent permanence tonight, 32 guests, 16 servants, 12 smoking chimneys, was standing on ground considerably less stable than it appeared. Death duties, the tax levied on inherited estates, had climbed steeply since before the war, and more than one family in this same county had already found itself unable to maintain a house of Aldermere scale once that tax came due on an inheritance. Sir Henry manages this autumn well enough, but the wider pattern across England in this decade was unmistakable. Older estates broken up, sold, or in the more painful cases, simply abandoned to slow decay, because no single family could any longer justify the cost of keeping 32 people's idea. Aldermere Hall, on this October night, still belongs entirely to the world we have been describing all evening. It would not belong to that world forever, and neither, in truth, would very many houses quite like it. Let us come back now to the house itself, because upstairs the last of the dancing has finally ended. And downstairs, Edith's night is not yet over. It is past 1 in the morning now, and the last of the guests have finally climbed the stairs to bed. The gramophone silent, its horn covered again with the small cloth kept for that purpose, the long gallery's cleared floor waiting to be a sitting room again by morning. Outside, the fog that gathered at dusk has thickened further and turned, sometime in the last hour, into a soft, steady rain, ticking against the leaded windows of the bedrooms one by one as their occupants settle in. This is the hour when Thomas moves quietly from room to room, banking each downstairs fire for the night, not putting it out, but smothering it down with damp peat so that it will smoulder slowly until morning rather than burning itself to nothing by 3. A small skill that took him the better part of a year to learn properly when he first came to Aldermere as a boy of 16. Upstairs, Edith and Peg make their own final circuit of the guest wing, each one carrying a pair of copper hot water bottles wrapped in flannel, so thick it barely scalds the hands. Carrying them, sliding one into the foot of each occupied bed before the room's guest has even finished undressing. then retreating before a word of thanks can be offered or expected. It takes both girls the better part of 40 minutes to cover every room, up and down the narrow spiral stairs at the end of each corridor, the rain outside growing steadily heavier against the windows with every trip. By 1:30, the house is, for the first time since before 6 the previous morning, entirely still. The dogs have been shut in the boot room. The last candle in the last guest bedroom has been blown out. And somewhere below all of it, the kitchen and the servants' hall and the narrow attic rooms tucked up under the roofline. The people who made this entire evening possible are at last allowed to stop. Step back now from the hours we have just spent inside Aldermere Hall, and something larger begins to come into focus, a set of patterns that this one autumn day reveals about the whole world it belonged to, patterns that reach a good deal further than a single house in Oxfordshire ever could on its own. The first pattern is the sheer invisibility of the labour that made a day like this one possible. From 6 in the morning until past 1 the following night, something close to 19 hours of continuous, physically demanding work stood behind every appearance of ease that the guests upstairs enjoyed, and almost none of it was ever meant to be seen. A fire that was simply burning when a guest woke, a newspaper that arrived already free of ink, a hot water bottle that appeared at the foot of a bed with no visible hand attached to it. This was not incidental to the design of a house like Aldermere Hall. It was the design. The entire architecture of the green baize door, the back stairs, the bell system that let a guest summon help without addressing a human being directly, existed to manufacture precisely this illusion. Rather than being carried up flights of stairs by a woman whose name most of the people benefiting from it would never learn. The second pattern sits close beside the first, and it concerns performance rather than labor, exactly, though the two are never entirely separable. Everyone in this house, upstairs and down, was performing a version of themselves for everyone else's benefit. Lady Margaret performed effortless hospitality while managing a household budget with real precision behind the scenes. Sir Henry performed the unhurried authority of a man untroubled by anything so vulgar as expense, while a death duty and a tightening national economy quietly narrowed his options year by year. And Edith performed invisibility itself, trained since girlhood to enter a room, complete a task, and withdraw as though she had barely been present at all, an entire skill set built around the art of not being noticed. What this pattern reveals is something worth sitting with a moment. Nobody in this house, at any level of its hierarchy, was simply being themselves at any point in this long day. Everyone was working in one form or another to sustain an impression, and the impression each person maintained said as much about the system holding them in place as it did about their own individual character. The third pattern is a gap, and it runs between what people were plainly capable of and what they were permitted to do with that capability. Edith Marlowe manages, over the course of a single day, the coordinated cleaning of dozens of rooms, the supervision of a younger girl's work, the physical logistics of moving water and coal and linen through a large house on a fixed and unforgiving schedule, and she does all of it with a competence that would be recognized in almost any other setting as genuine managerial skill. And yet the ceiling above her was fixed by her birth rather than her ability, a ceiling built from her limited early schooling, her sex, her class, and the simple fact that a housemaid, however capable, was not imagined by the world around her as a person with a career so much as a person filling a role. Her shorthand manual, hidden under its loose floorboard, is a quiet act of resistance against exactly that ceiling, though Edith herself would likely never describe it in such grand terms. She would simply say she is trying to get on. The fourth pattern concerns money, and specifically the way an entire economy of appearance ran beneath the surface of this one evening. A gown that cost more than a scullery maid's yearly wage. A rule dictating precisely which jewels could be worn before 8 o'clock and which only after. A wine cellar, stocked and maintained at an expense that could have paid 3 housemaids' wages twice over. None of this spending purchased anything with practical value in the ordinary sense. It purchased an impression held in the minds of 32 witnesses for a single evening, that a family like the Calloways could produce abundance without visible effort. Wealth of this kind, in this era, was not primarily about comfort. It was a language spoken through fabric and jewels and courses of food, and the fluency required to speak it correctly, knowing exactly what could be worn at exactly which hour, cost as much in its own way as the objects themselves. The fifth pattern, and perhaps the quietest of the 5, concerns how thoroughly this world had built itself around never requiring 2 people to speak to one another directly, if a system could be interposed between them instead. A bell replaced a spoken request, a tray replaced a handed object, a courtesy title replaced a first name, and a first name, in turn, sometimes replaced a servant's own name entirely. Even the moment we witnessed earlier today, Edith and Miss Diana, crossing paths in a quiet corridor, passed without a single word exchanged, though both women plainly recognized something of themselves in the other for that brief instant. This mediation was not cruelty exactly, or at least not intentional cruelty. It was structure built up over centuries, designed to let an enormous amount of intimate daily labor pass between 2 very unequal parties, without either one ever having to fully reckon with what that inequality actually meant for the person on the other side of it. Taken together, these 5 patterns describe something larger than one house or one family or even one class of English society in the 1920s. They describe a way of organizing human effort so thoroughly that the effort itself could disappear from view, leaving behind only its results, a warm room, a well-set table, an evening that felt, to those enjoying it, entirely natural. And that, more than the champagne or the pearls or the gramophone music drifting through the long gallery, is the real subject of tonight's story. Not the party itself, but everything that had to remain unseen in order for the party to feel effortless. Let's go back up one final time to the narrow staircase where we first met Edith this morning, because that is where her day, in the end, has to finish. It is nearly 2 in the morning by the time she climbs it, her candle throwing the same small circle of light it threw 19 hours ago, though the stairs themselves feel different beneath her feet now. Each tread a small effort her legs register clearly even through the fog of pure tiredness. Peg is already asleep by the time Edith reaches the attic room they share. Curled facing the wall, her breathing slow and even, and Edith undresses quietly in the dark rather than light a second candle. It cannot spare, folding her uniform over the single chair by habit rather than sight, since her hands could complete this particular motion blind after 6 years of practice. Before she lies down, she checks, as she does most nights, the loose floorboard beneath her side of the bed. Not to add anything to the tin box hidden there, but simply to know it is still in its place. The shorthand manual, the pencil stub, the library card. The small private evidence of a life she is quietly building underneath the one she is required to live in daylight. She does not open the box tonight. There is not enough candle left, and not enough of herself left either, after a day that carried her from before 6 this morning to nearly 2 the following night. She simply rests her palm flat against the floorboard for a moment, the way another woman might touch a locket, and then draws her hand back and lies down. Pinned to the corkboard downstairs in the servants' hall, in Mrs. Yarrow's small and exact handwriting, tomorrow's duty rota is already written out in full. Edith's name appearing at the top of the list, beside the words, "Fires, 6:30. The same 2 words that will greet her again in barely 4 hours' time. The day that has just ended is already, in the most literal sense, available to this house, beginning again before it is finished. The schedule for Sunday, drawn up before Saturday's candles, have even gone properly out. Outside, the rain that began sometime after midnight has settled into a steady, unhurried patter against the small dormer window above Edith's bed, and somewhere below, in a bedroom considerably larger and considerably warmer than this one, Lady Margaret has been asleep for over an hour already, her own long day of hosting finally set down. Down the corridor from her, Miss Diana lies awake little longer than her mother, turning over in her mind whatever it was that stood behind her expression at the window this afternoon. The same expression Edith recognized without ever being told what caused it. Neither woman knows that a housemaid noticed. Neither ever will. But for tonight, in their separate rooms, separated by a floor and a set of stairs and an entire structure of rank neither of them built and neither can fully see the edges of, both of these women are simply, finally, tired in roughly the same quiet way. Downstairs, Mr. V. Pruitt makes his own final round of the ground floor rooms, checking that every downstairs fire has been properly banked, that every door stands locked against the wet dark outside. A task he has performed at the close of every day for 11 years and will perform again tomorrow and very likely for a good many years still to come. The house settles around him room by room as he moves through it, the drawing-room fire glowing low and red under its blanket of damp peat, the dining room silent and cleared, the long gallery's floor already resuming its ordinary shape as a sitting room rather than a dance floor. By the time he climbs his own stairs to bed, every visible sign of tonight's dinner and dancing has been folded away, and the house wears, once again, the same still and settled face it wore this same time last night and the night before that and countless nights before either of those. Somewhere in the walls between the two worlds we have spent this whole evening moving between. A single bell on the board outside the kitchen sits silent now for the first time in 19 hours, its coiled spring at rest, its small brass dome catching nothing but a thin grey wash of moonlight through the passage window. Nobody is ringing for anything. Nobody needs anything carried, or lit, or pressed, or polished. For a handful of hours, until the whole quiet machine of this house begins turning again in the dark before dawn, there is truly nothing left for anyone to do but sleep. Beyond the house, the whole dark valley is settling into the same rain, the same stillness. Down in Shepton Underhill, the last lamp in the smithy has been put out, the vicar's own small window gone dark an hour ago, the tenant cottages along the crooked high street breathing their own quiet chimney smoke up into a sky that holds no moon tonight, only cloud and steady rain, and somewhere far to the west, a coalfield still waiting out its own long, harder night. None of these small lives touch one another directly. The manor and the village, the family and the miners, the drawing room and the laundry building. And yet they were, all of them, part of the very same autumn, the very same stretch of English countryside, breathing the same damp night air until morning came and asked something different of each of them all over again. That is where we will leave them tonight, friend. Sir Henry and Lady Margaret in the largest bedroom in the house, and Edith Marlowe in the smallest, both finally still, both breathing the same slow rhythm the rain outside seems to be keeping time with against the glass. Tomorrow the fires will need laying again at 6:30, and the silver will need polishing, and 32 guests will become, in time, some other number entirely, And this exact evening, gowns and pearls and chalk and spirits and all will fold itself quietly into the past and become precisely the kind of evening we have spent tonight remembering. Whatever you carried into this evening with you, whatever list of tomorrow's obligations is waiting somewhere for you, the way Edith was waiting for her on that corkboard downstairs, you can leave it exactly where it is a little longer. The rain is still falling on a house that stopped needing anyone's attention hours ago. The fires are banked low and safe until morning. Wherever you are tonight, whatever the clock reads, where you have settled in, I am glad you spent this stretch of it here, in a quiet corner of an autumn that ended a very long time ago. And yet, the length of this evening. Sleep well, friend. The house is finally, completely at rest. And so, I hope, are you.